Charles Hamilton Houston was an American legal giant and a transformative figure who became one of the most influential architects of the civil rights movement. Charles Hamilton Houston, lawyer, educator, and strategist, was born in Washington, D.C. on September 3, 1895. He came from a middle-class African-American family that valued education and achievement. He had a distinctive personality marked by brilliant intellect and an unwavering commitment to justice. Houston's early years were shaped by the realities of racial segregation and the determination to overcome it. His father, William LaPree Houston, was a lawyer and government worker who had managed to achieve professional success despite the barriers facing Black Americans. His mother, Mary Hamilton Houston, was a hairdresser and former school teacher who instilled in her only child the importance of education and excellence. The family lived in a segregated Washington, a city that, despite being the nation's capital, enforced strict racial separation in virtually every aspect of life. Young Charles, as he was called, learned early that being Black in America meant facing obstacles that white Americans never encountered, but he also learned that education and determination could open doors. He attended the racially segregated public schools of Washington, D.C., where he excelled academically. The schools for Black children were inferior to those for whites, with fewer resources and older facilities, but Houston's teachers were dedicated professionals who pushed their students to achieve. Houston graduated from the M Street High School, later renamed Dunbar High School, one of the premier academic institutions for Black students in America. The school had rigorous standards and a faculty that included some of the best educated African Americans in the country. Houston thrived in this environment, developing the intellectual discipline and confidence that would define his career. In 1911, at age 15, Houston entered Amherst College in Massachusetts, one of the few prestigious Northeastern colleges that admitted Black students. He was one of only a handful of African-American students at Amherst, and he faced social isolation and racial prejudice. White students largely ignored him, and he was excluded from many campus activities. But Houston refused to be deterred. He threw himself into his studies and excelled academically. He joined the debate team and became known for his analytical mind and persuasive speaking. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1915, one of only 6 students in his class to receive that honor. His academic success proved that Black students could compete with anyone when given the opportunity. After graduating from Amherst, Houston briefly taught English at Howard University in Washington, D.C. But his plans were interrupted by World War I when the United States entered the war in April 1917. Houston was determined to serve. He was 21 years old and could have avoided military service, but he felt a duty to his country. He joined the Army and was sent to an officer training camp for Black soldiers at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. The military was strictly segregated, and Black soldiers faced discrimination and second-class treatment. Houston was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the infantry and sent to France with the American Expeditionary Force. He served as an artillery officer with the 368th Infantry Regiment, a segregated unit. The experience of serving in a segregated military while fighting for democracy abroad had a profound impact on Houston. He witnessed the contradiction of Black soldiers fighting for freedom overseas while being denied basic rights at home. He experienced the humiliation of segregation and the casual racism of white officers. He saw Black soldiers treated with respect by the French, who did not share American racial attitudes, only to be subjected to discrimination by their own army. The war ended in November 1918, and Houston returned home with a new sense of purpose. He had decided to become a lawyer and use the law as a weapon to fight racial injustice. He later said that his wartime experiences convinced him that the fight for Black equality would have to be fought in the courts, and that lawyers would be the soldiers in that fight. In 1919, Houston enrolled at Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious law schools in America. He was one of only a few Black students in his class. Harvard was intellectually demanding and socially isolating. Houston faced the same social exclusion he had experienced at Amherst, but he was now more focused and determined. He studied obsessively, spending long hours in the library mastering legal principles and developing his analytical skills. Houston excelled at Harvard. He became the first Black student elected to the Harvard Law Review, the prestigious journal edited by top students. This was an extraordinary achievement that marked him as one of the best legal minds of his generation. He studied under Felix Frankfurter, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, and other leading legal scholars. He graduated in 1922 with honors and was awarded a scholarship for graduate study. Houston spent the next year studying at the University of Madrid in Spain, where he earned a Doctor of Juridical Science degree. The experience of living in Europe, where he faced less racial discrimination than in America, reinforced his determination to challenge segregation at home. He returned to the United States in 1923, ready to begin his legal career. Houston joined his father's law practice in Washington, D.C., forming the firm of Houston & Houston. The practice focused on serving the Black community, handling a variety of civil and criminal cases. Houston quickly established himself as a skilled and dedicated attorney. He took cases that other lawyers avoided, including defending black defendants accused of crimes in a legal system biased against them. He won cases that seemed unwinnable through careful preparation and brilliant courtroom advocacy, but Houston's ambitions extended beyond private practice. He wanted to attack the system of segregation itself, to use the law to dismantle the legal framework that kept black Americans as second-class citizens. He understood that individual cases, while important, would not bring about fundamental change. What was needed was a systematic legal campaign to challenge segregation. In 1924, Houston began teaching part-time at Howard University School of Law while maintaining his private practice. Howard Law School was struggling, with low academic standards and inadequate facilities. It was in danger of losing its accreditation. Houston saw an opportunity to transform the school into an institution that could train lawyers for the fight against segregation. In 1929, Houston was appointed Vice Dean of Howard Law School and given the authority to reform the institution. He was 33 years old and ready to build something extraordinary. He immediately set about raising academic standards, improving facilities, and recruiting better faculty. He insisted that Howard Law School should be as rigorous as any white law school. He increased the entrance requirements, expanded the curriculum, and demanded more from students. Many students complained about the increased difficulty, but Houston was unmoved. He told them that black lawyers had to be better than white lawyers to succeed in a racist society. He pushed his students relentlessly, preparing them not just to practice law but to become social engineers who would use the law to transform society. Houston taught constitutional law and civil rights, and his classes became legendary. He demanded that students master not just legal doctrine, but the strategic thinking needed to challenge unjust laws. He taught them to see the law as a tool for social change. He brought in guest speakers, organized moot courts, and created a culture of excellence and activism. Under Houston's leadership, Howard Law School was transformed. It became fully accredited and developed a reputation as a training ground for civil rights lawyers. Houston recruited talented faculty and built a curriculum focused on civil rights and constitutional law. He created a legal clinic where students could gain practical experience while serving the community. Most importantly, Houston developed a strategy for attacking segregation through the courts. He understood that the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which had established the separate but equal doctrine, was the legal foundation for segregation. That decision held that racial segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities provided for blacks and whites were equal. Houston recognized that this doctrine was vulnerable to attack. In reality, facilities for black Americans were never equal to those for whites. Schools for black children received far less funding, had inferior buildings, and lacked basic resources. If the courts could be forced to honestly examine whether separate facilities were actually equal, the entire system of segregation could be challenged. Houston developed a carefully planned legal strategy. Rather than attacking segregation directly, which the courts would likely reject, he would file lawsuits demanding that states actually provide equal facilities for black citizens. When states refused or were unable to provide truly equal facilities, the courts would be forced to either order equality or admit that segregation itself was inherently unequal. Houston focused initially on education, believing that school segregation was particularly vulnerable to legal challenge. He began filing lawsuits challenging inequality in schools, carefully selecting cases that would establish favorable precedents. He worked closely with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which provided funding and organizational support for civil rights litigation. In 1935, Houston argued his first major case before the Supreme Court. The case, University of Maryland versus Murray, challenged the University of Maryland Law School's refusal to admit black students. Houston argued that Maryland's failure to provide a law school for black students violated the separate but equal doctrine. The Maryland courts agreed, ordering the law school to admit black students. It was a significant victory that demonstrated the potential of Houston's legal strategy. Houston left Howard Law School in 1935 to become the NAACP's first full-time special counsel. He was now in a position to coordinate a national legal campaign against segregation. He traveled throughout the South, investigating conditions in segregated schools, recruiting plaintiffs for lawsuits, and training local lawyers. The work was dangerous. Houston traveled through areas where white supremacy was enforced through violence and intimidation. He faced threats and hostility, but he never wavered. He documented the shocking inequality in Southern schools, photographing dilapidated buildings, inadequate facilities, and the stark differences between white and black schools. This evidence would be crucial in future court cases. Houston argued several important cases before the Supreme Court in the late 1930s. In Missouri ex rel. Gaines versus Canada, decided in 1938, Houston successfully argued that Missouri's refusal to admit a black student to its law school violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court ruled that states must provide equal educational opportunities within their borders, not simply offer to pay for black students to attend out-of-state schools. It was another important victory that further undermined the separate but equal doctrine. Houston worked punishing hours, often sleeping only a few hours a night. He supervised numerous cases simultaneously, trained younger lawyers, and developed strategy for the long-term campaign. He was demanding of himself and others, insisting on meticulous preparation and excellent legal work. He knew that civil rights lawyers could not afford to make mistakes, that every case had to be perfectly prepared and argued. Among the young lawyers Houston trained and mentored was Thurgood Marshall, who had been one of his students at Howard Law School. Marshall became Houston's protege and assistant, learning legal strategy and courtroom advocacy from the master. Houston recognized Marshall's talent and groomed him to continue the fight. The two men worked closely together, with Houston gradually giving Marshall more responsibility. In 1940, Houston stepped down as special counsel to the NAACP due to exhaustion and health problems. The relentless pace had taken a toll on his health. He returned to private practice in Washington, D.C., but he remained deeply involved in civil rights litigation. He continued to argue important cases and advise on legal strategy. Houston's private practice flourished. He handled a variety of cases including labor law, civil rights, and criminal defense. He argued cases before the Supreme Court and won important victories. He represented labor unions and fought against discriminatory employment practices. He was recognized as one of the leading lawyers in America, regardless of race. Despite his success, Houston remained focused on the fight against segregation. He continued to work on civil rights cases without compensation, viewing it as his duty. He argued cases challenging segregation in housing, transportation, and employment. He developed legal theories and strategies that would be used in future civil rights litigation. Houston also remained involved with Howard Law School, serving on its board and continuing to mentor young lawyers. He watched with pride as his former students became leaders in the civil rights movement. Thurgood Marshall, now heading the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was continuing the campaign Houston had started, filing lawsuits challenging school segregation throughout the South. In the late 1940s, Houston's health began to deteriorate. He suffered from heart disease, the result of years of stress and overwork. He was forced to reduce his workload, but he could not stop completely. He continued to work on cases and provide advice to younger lawyers. He was determined to see the legal campaign against segregation succeed. Houston worked on several important cases in his final years. He helped develop the legal strategy for cases challenging segregation in graduate and professional schools. These cases were building toward a direct challenge to the Plessy decision itself. Houston knew that the ultimate goal was to convince the Supreme Court that segregation was inherently unconstitutional, that separate could never be equal. In early 1950, Houston's health worsened significantly. He suffered a severe heart attack and was hospitalized. He knew he was dying, but he remained concerned about the civil rights cases still pending. He met with Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers, discussing strategy and offering advice. He wanted to ensure that the work would continue after his death. On April 22, 1950, Charles Hamilton Houston died at Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was 54 years old. The cause of death was heart failure. His death was mourned throughout the black community and by civil rights advocates across the nation. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including lawyers, judges, educators, and civil rights leaders. He was buried in Lincoln Memorial Cemetery in Suitland, Maryland. Houston did not live to see his greatest victory. 4 years after his death in 1954, the Supreme Court decided Brown v. Board of Education, ruling that school segregation was unconstitutional. The decision overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. It was the culmination of the legal strategy Houston had developed and the campaign he had led. Thurgood Marshall, Houston's protege, argued the case before the Supreme Court. Marshall later said that the victory belonged to Charles Houston, that Houston had laid the foundation and developed the strategy that made Brown possible. The lawyers who argued the case had all been trained by Houston or influenced by his methods. The legal theories used in Brown had been developed by Houston. The careful selection of cases and the systematic building of precedents had been Houston's strategy. Houston's legacy extends far beyond the cases he personally argued. He transformed Howard Law School into the training ground for civil rights lawyers. He developed the legal strategy that dismantled segregation. He trained and mentored a generation of lawyers who continued the fight. He demonstrated that the law could be used as a tool for social change, and that systematic legal action could transform society. Modern historians recognize Houston as the architect of the legal campaign that ended legal segregation. His methodical approach, his brilliant legal mind, and his strategic thinking made the civil rights victories of the 1950s and 1960s possible. He understood that changing unjust laws required more than moral arguments. It required careful legal strategy, meticulous preparation, and the patience to build cases over years and decades. Houston's influence on American law and society is profound. The legal methods he developed are still used by civil rights lawyers today. The principle that lawyers should be social engineers using the law to advance justice became a fundamental concept in legal education. His insistence on excellence and rigorous preparation became the standard for civil rights advocacy. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Charles Hamilton Houston comes from Thurgood Marshall, who said that Houston was the engineer of the civil rights revolution. Marshall, who would become the first black Supreme Court justice, always acknowledged that his own achievements were built on Houston's foundation. Houston's former students and colleagues remembered him as a demanding teacher, a brilliant lawyer, and a man completely dedicated to justice. Houston represented a particular type of American hero, the intellectual warrior who fought injustice through law and reason rather than violence. His weapon was legal argument, his battlefield was the courtroom, and his victory was the transformation of American society. His story inspired generations of lawyers and activists who saw in him proof that systematic effort and brilliant strategy could overcome even the most entrenched injustice. In the end, Charles Hamilton Houston was neither a household name nor a public celebrity, but rather an extraordinary strategist who changed America. His legacy includes the legal victories he won, the lawyers he trained, and the strategy he developed that ended legal segregation. He is remembered today as the man who killed Jim Crow, the lawyer who dismantled segregation through careful legal work and brilliant strategic thinking. His life spanned an era of tremendous struggle for Black Americans. From the height of Jim Crow segregation to the beginning of its end, he participated in that struggle and shaped its direction. Houston was in death as in life a man of intellect and purpose, remembered for his brilliance, his dedication, and his unwavering commitment to justice and equality under law.